Colonel Raymond Hope pressed the barrel of his pistol directly against Dr. Marsh's temple and said, without raising his voice, without blinking, without a single tremor of hesitation, "You have 60 seconds to bring me Angel 6, or I start making this hospital a lot quieter." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A soldier slammed a rifle butt into the nurse's station monitor. Glass exploded across the floor, and Holt didn't even flinch. He just kept his eyes on the room, cold and surgical, like a man who had already decided how this night would end. And at the far end of the hallway, behind a supply room door, one quiet nurse heard everything and stopped breathing. If this story is already gripping you, please take a second right now and subscribe to our channel. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Flora Montgomery had spent 3 years learning how to disappear. Not the dramatic kind of disappearing, no fake passports slid across dimly lit counters, no midnight border crossings, nothing cinematic. What she had done was quieter and, in many ways, harder. She had learned how to make herself forgettable, how to walk into a room and occupy exactly the right amount of space, enough to be functional, never enough to be remarkable. She had learned to keep her voice at a register that didn't carry, to let her eyes rest somewhere neutral whenever conversation pushed too close to personal. She had mastered the art of being present without being seen. And after 3 years of practice, she was very, very good at it. At Mercy Ridge Community Hospital in Clover Falls, Oregon, she was simply Flora. The night shift nurse with the steady hands, the one who never panicked, never complained, never lingered after a shift to gossip or laugh too loudly in the break room. The other nurses liked her well enough. She was competent and kind. But if you asked any of them to describe her after a shift, most would pause and say something like, "Oh, Flora, she's reliable." And then they'd move on to talking about someone else. That was exactly what she wanted. On the night of March 14th, Flora arrived at Mercy Ridge at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before her shift began, the same as always. She signed in at the nurse's station, pulled her dark hair back with the same 2 pins she always used, and started her rounds. The ER was quiet by hospital standards. A teenage boy in room 3 with a broken wrist, skateboarding accident, his mother furious, his father trying not to laugh. An elderly man in room 7 being treated for dehydration. A woman in her 40s in room 2, chest pains that had already been ruled cardiac and were almost certainly stress-related. Flora moved between them efficiently, checking charts, adjusting IVs, speaking in that low, unhurried voice that patients always seemed to find calming, even when they couldn't explain why. Dr. Alan Marsh, the attending physician that night, was a decent enough man, perpetually tired, with reading glasses that had been broken at the left hinge and repaired twice with electrical tape. He noticed Flora the way you notice a reliable appliance, gratefully and without much thought. "Montgomery," he said, passing her in the hall around 11:15, "Barnes in room 2 is asking about discharge. Can you walk him through the paperwork?" "The chest pain patient?" Flora said. "That's Ms. Reyes, not Barnes. Room 2. Marsh blinked. Right, yes. Reyes, I'm losing my mind." He rubbed his face. "Barnes is... Actually, no, never mind. I have no patient named Barnes." He laughed at himself and shuffled away. Flora watched him go and felt nothing. The name had passed through the air like any other name. She hadn't let it land. Or so she told herself. She was at the nurse's station at 11:47, updating a chart on the computer when she felt it. Not heard, felt. A vibration, low and rhythmic, traveling up through the floor from somewhere outside. Her hands stopped moving on the keyboard. She sat very still. The vibration grew. Sandra Kowalski, the other nurse on duty that night, looked up from her paperwork and frowned. "Is that thunder?" Flora didn't answer. She was already counting. The rhythm was too consistent, too mechanical. Her body knew what it was before her mind finished the thought. Rotor blades. More than one aircraft. And they were close. Dropping altitude fast, which meant they were not passing over. They were landing. That's weird, Sandra said. Helicopters? Yes, Flora said. Her voice was perfectly calm. Probably a trauma transport. I'll go check with admissions. She was already standing, already moving. Not running, she never ran when she didn't have to, but moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with trauma transports. She turned the corner toward the ambulance bay exit and looked through the reinforced glass panel in the door. What she saw stopped her cold. 8 helicopters. Not the white and orange medevac birds she'd expected. These were military. Black, low profile, with no visible markings. The kind that didn't exist on any official aviation manifest. They were coming down in the hospital's outer parking lot, in the surrounding field, and on the roof. Even as she watched, the rotor wash was flattening the grass in long, violent waves, and the first boots were hitting the ground. Soldiers in tactical gear, rifles up, moving in practiced formations. Flora's heart rate did not spike. That was the thing about her training. Her body had been conditioned not to panic, not to flood with adrenaline at the worst possible moment. Instead, everything in her became very quiet and very sharp. The way a blade becomes sharper the more carefully you grind it. She turned away from the door and walked, not ran, back toward the nurse's station. Sandra looked up. So, trauma transport? No, Flora said. Listen to me carefully. I need you to start moving ambulatory patients away from the ER entrance. Quietly. Tell them it's routine procedure. Sandra stared at her. What? Why? Flora, what's going on? I don't know yet, Flora said, which was a lie. The first deliberate lie she had told at this hospital in 3 years. But those are military helicopters. And when military helicopters land at a civilian hospital without any advance notice, you move patients away from the entry points. That's just common sense. Sandra looked like she wanted to argue. Then, through the walls, they both heard it. The main entrance doors bursting open, the clatter of boots on linoleum, voices giving orders in tight, clipped tones. Sandra went pale. Oh my God. Go, Flora said quietly. Now. As Sandra scrambled up, Flora moved in the opposite direction, toward the supply corridor, toward the back of the ER, calculating distances and exits with the practiced speed of someone who had mapped every building she'd lived in for the past 3 years. It was not paranoia. She had always told herself it was not paranoia. It was preparedness. She heard a man's voice cut through the ER, not shouting but carrying with the kind of authority that didn't need volume. Nobody leaves. Everybody stays exactly where they are. We are looking for one individual, and once we have that individual, we will be gone. You have my word. Flora pressed herself against the wall of the supply corridor and listened. She knew that voice. The way you know the sound of something that once hurt you badly. Not because you remember it consciously, but because your body does. Colonel Raymond Holt. 3 years. She had given him 3 years of silence and distance and carefully constructed absence. And he had walked into her hospital anyway, with 8 helicopters and a squad of soldiers, as casually as a man collecting a debt. She felt something move through her chest. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had teeth. At the nurse's station, she could hear Sandra's voice, high and frightened. Sir, this is a medical facility. You can't just... And then a soldier's flat, practiced interruption. Ma'am, please step aside. Flora closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she ran through her options with the methodical clarity she'd been trained to use when options were limited and time was short. She could go out the back. The service exit at the far end of the corridor would take her to the alley behind the building. From there, she had memorized 3 different routes that would take her to a vehicle she'd kept maintained and ready for precisely this eventuality. She could be gone in 4 minutes. She could also stay. She could find out what Holt wanted, why he had come tonight, why he had brought 8 aircraft and a full tactical unit to a small community hospital in suburban Oregon just to collect one person. The answer to that question had a shape she was beginning to recognize, and it frightened her more than Holt's presence did. Because if he needed this many resources to collect her, it wasn't because he was angry. It was because he needed something. And the only thing Colonel Raymond Holt had ever needed from her was the thing she did best. The thought arrived before she was ready for it. Someone is dying. She didn't move yet. She listened. Holt's voice again, still controlled, still carrying. I understand this is alarming. My name is Colonel Raymond Holt, United States Special Operations Command. I am not here to harm anyone. I am here for one person, and that person knows who they are. A pause. Angel 6. If you can hear me, I am asking you, not ordering you, asking you to make yourself known. There is no time for games tonight. The ER went completely silent. Flora could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. Then Dr. Marsh's voice, confused, annoyed, the voice of a man who had dealt with enough institutional nonsense in his career that even soldiers with rifles didn't particularly intimidate him. I'm sorry, Angel 6? What does that mean? Is that a person? We don't have any patient by that. Not a patient, Holt said. A member of this staff. Another silence. Flora could picture the scene without seeing it. Marsh frowning behind his taped-together glasses. Sandra somewhere near the wall, trying to remember if her union contract had anything to say about military incursions. The soldiers spread through the room with the patient stillness of people who did this for a living. One of our nurses, Marsh said. I can't discuss further details, Holt said, but yes. Marsh laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Colonel, whoever told you that one of my night shift nurses is some kind of military operative has been feeding you some very creative intelligence. I've got 2 nurses on tonight, Sandra Kowalski, who has worked here for 11 years, and Flora Montgomery, who has worked here for 3. They are nurses, that's it. Flora Montgomery, Holt said, and something in the way he said it, quiet, certain, final, made the hair rise on Flora's arms. Yes, I know. He didn't say it like he'd just learned the name. He said it like he'd been carrying it for a long time. Flora pressed her back against the supply shelving and breathed slowly. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. Her hands were perfectly steady. They had always been perfectly steady, even in conditions that should have made steadiness impossible. It was her gift. It was also, she had come to understand, her burden. She heard footsteps moving down the main corridor. Soldiers fanning out, methodical. They were going to search the building. She had maybe 3 minutes before someone reached the supply corridor. She could run. The exit was 40 feet away. She should run. She had built this quiet life with enormous care and at enormous personal cost. The loneliness of it, the relentless low-grade vigilance, the way she sometimes sat in her apartment at 2 in the morning and felt the shape of everything she'd left behind pressing against the inside of her chest, like something trying to get out. She had paid for this life. She had earned the right to protect it. But someone is dying. She hated that thought. She hated how quickly it rose and how impossible it was to push back down. She hated that after everything they had put her through, after the choices that had been made and the price she had personally paid for those choices, her first instinct was still this. Still the instinct to go toward the wound instead of away from it. She heard boots in the hallway to her left, closer than she'd expected. They were faster than she'd given them credit for. Flora made her decision. She stepped out of the supply corridor and into the main hall, and she said, in a voice that was calm and clear and carried exactly as far as it needed to, "Tell Colonel Holt I'm in the South Corridor, and tell him he has 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't walk out that back door right now." The soldier who had been rounding the corner stopped dead. He was young Younger than she'd expected, mid-20s maybe, and for a moment he just stared at her. She watched his training kick in, the surprise suppressed, the radio raised. "Sir," he said into the handset, "we have her. South Corridor." Flora crossed her arms and waited. Holt came quickly. She'd give him that. He moved with the same purposeful economy she remembered. No wasted motion, no theatrics. Just a man who always knew exactly where he was going and exactly why. He turned the corner and stopped when he saw her. And for one brief moment, something crossed his face that wasn't quite what she expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, relief. She hadn't expected relief. It complicated things. "Flora," he said. "Colonel," she said. He looked at her the way you look at something you'd been told might not exist anymore, making sure it was real. Then he said, "You look well." "Don't," she said. "Don't do that. You didn't bring 8 helicopters to tell me I look well. What happened?" Holt glanced at the soldier who had been following him, and the man stepped back, out of earshot, with the instinctive discretion of someone who understood when a conversation needed privacy. "Michael Barnes," Holt said. The name landed differently the second time she heard it tonight. Dr. Marsh had said it by accident, reaching for the wrong name in a tired brain. Holt said it the way you say the name of someone who is right now, in this moment, fighting to stay alive. Something tightened in Flora's chest. What happened to Barnes? "Extraction went wrong," Holt said. "He took 2 rounds, one in the chest, one in the upper abdomen. We have him stable, barely, but the surgical team at base lost him on the table twice. He's deteriorating. We couldn't get him to a facility with the right clearance in time. So you brought him to me. You're the only one who has ever kept him alive when he shouldn't have been," Holt said. And there was something in his voice that was the closest she'd ever heard Raymond Holt come to saying, "Please. You know his physiology better than anyone. You know his history, his complications, the way he responds to—" "I know why you brought him to me," Flora said. "I'm asking why you thought I would help you." Holt was quiet for a moment. He had the intelligence not to look surprised by the question. "Because whatever happened between us," he said carefully, "and I understand that I owe you a conversation about that, a real one, not a debriefing. Whatever happened, this is Barnes. And I think you know that whatever you feel about me, that's not what determines what you do next." Flora stared at him for a long moment. She hated that he was right. She hated how well he still knew her. "Where is he?" she said. "Helicopter 2. We can move him into your ER or—" "No," she said immediately. "The ER is not set up for that level of trauma. What surgical equipment do you have on the aircraft?" Holt blinked. I need a full list, now, not a summary, a full list. And I need your field medic's name and their experience level, because whoever has been managing him is going to brief me before I touch anything. Do you understand? And I need your soldiers out of my ER. Every one of them. My staff is frightened. My patients are frightened. And I cannot work in a room full of rifles." She watched something shift in Holt's expression. The subtle recalibration of a man who had walked in expecting one version of this woman and was being rapidly confronted with another. "Done," he said. "All of it. And Colonel," she held his gaze, "when this is over, when Barnes is stable and this is done, you and I are going to have that conversation. Not a debriefing, not a mission brief, a real conversation about what happened. About why I'm standing in a hospital in Oregon under a name that isn't mine. You understand me?" Holt met her eyes. Understood. Flora uncrossed her arms and started moving toward the ER entrance, already running calculations, already shifting into the part of herself that she kept contained and quiet and out of sight during the long, ordinary days of her ordinary life. She was aware as she passed the nurse's station of Sandra staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Awareness, maybe, or the beginning of awareness. The slow revision of everything Sandra thought she knew about the woman she worked with. Dr. Marsh was standing near the entrance with two soldiers flanking him, his broken glasses slightly askew, and he looked at Flora as she came through and said, in a tone that was somewhere between outrage and stunned disbelief, "Flora, what on earth are you? What is happening?" "I'll explain what I can when I can," she said, not slowing down. "Right now I need you to clear Trauma Bay 1 and assist me with a critical patient. Chest and abdominal wounds, 2 rounds, approximately." She looked at Holt. "How long ago?" 3 hours and 12 minutes since impact," Holt said. 3 hours post-impact," she repeated to Marsh. "He's been field managed. We need to reassess and stabilize for transport to a proper facility." She was already pulling gloves from the dispenser on the wall. "Can you do that?" Marsh looked at the soldiers. He looked at Holt. He looked at Flora, really looked at her, maybe for the first time. And whatever he saw made him straighten up and say, "Yes, yes, I can do that." "Good," she snapped the first glove on. "Then let's go." She walked through the ER doors and into the rotor wash of 8 military helicopters, and the night air hit her face, and for one moment she let herself feel the full weight of it. The 3 years of silence ending, the life she had built so carefully cracking open, the woman she had tried so hard to put away, stepping back into the light. She had not asked for this night. She had not wanted it. But her hands were steady. They were always steady, and somewhere in Helicopter 2, Michael Barnes was running out of time. Flora stepped through those ER doors, and the night hit her like a wall. Cold, sharp, carrying the smell of aviation fuel and wet grass, and something else underneath it all. Something metallic that she recognized without wanting to. Blood. Even from 50 feet away, through the rotor wash and the organized chaos of soldiers moving in formation, she could smell it. Barnes was bleeding, still bleeding, even now, 3 hours after the rounds had torn through him, which meant whatever the field medic had done hadn't been enough. She moved toward Helicopter 2 without being directed. She didn't need direction. She counted the aircraft as she walked, 8, just as she'd estimated, positioned with the tactical precision that told her this wasn't improvised. Holt had planned this. He had known where she was, known the layout of this parking lot, known which approach gave his aircraft the best landing configuration. He had planned every detail of this operation, which meant he had been watching her for longer than tonight. That thought settled into her chest like a stone dropping into still water, and she filed it away for later because later was the only place she could afford to put it right now. "Ma'am," a soldier fell into step beside her, young, female, corporal's insignia, a medical bag over her shoulder. "I'm Corporal Reyes. I've been primary on Barnes since extraction." "Talk," Flora said. "Everything. Don't summarize. Give me the full picture." Corporal Reyes didn't hesitate, which Flora respected. 2 GSWs, like the colonel said. First round entered the right chest, mid-clavicular line, 4th intercostal space. We had a pneumothorax within the first 8 minutes. I did a needle decompression in the field, followed by a chest tube insertion approximately 40 minutes post-impact. Lung re-expanded. He maintained oxygen sats in the low 80s for about an hour, then they started dropping again. I think the tube has shifted. And the abdominal wound? Left upper quadrant. Entry wound is approximately 3 centimeters. No exit. The round is still in there. Reyes paused, and Flora heard something in that pause. A controlled fear. The kind a good medic carries when they know they've hit the edge of what they can manage. "I'm worried about the spleen. His pressure has been trending down for the last 40 minutes, despite fluids. Slow drop, but consistent." Flora processed this without slowing her pace. Splenic injury with a retained round, deteriorating pressure, a shifted chest tube, 3 hours post-impact. The window was not closed, but it was narrowing, and it would not stay open out of courtesy. She reached the helicopter and pulled herself up without waiting for assistance. The interior was dim, lit by the red glow of portable medical lighting, and Barnes was on the stretcher in the center, his face the color of old concrete, his chest rising and falling in the short, effortful way of someone whose body is working very hard to do something that should be automatic. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she pulled on fresh gloves, leaned in, and started her assessment. "Barnes," she said, not loudly but firmly. "Michael, can you hear me?" His eyelids moved. "Not much, enough." "Don't talk," she said. "Just listen. I'm here. You're going to be okay, but I need you to stay with me." She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, counting, and reached for the stethoscope around Reyes's neck without asking. She listened to his chest. Left side, clear enough. Right side, she moved the stethoscope, repositioned, listened again, diminished. The tube had definitely shifted. She pulled back the dressing over the chest tube insertion site and confirmed it visually. "The tube has migrated," she said to Reyes. "You did the right things. The tube moved because he's been in transit. Not your fault. I'm going to reposition it. What's his pressure right now?" Reyes checked the portable monitor. 88/54. Not good. Not catastrophic yet, but the trajectory was wrong. Flora took the tube, careful, precise, feeling the resistance and then the give as she repositioned it into the correct space and taped it securely. "Now," she said. Reyes checked again, waited. Sats climbing. 86, 88, 91. Good. Flora pressed carefully along Barnes's abdomen, watching his face as she did. Even unconscious, the response to pain is honest. And what his face told her confirmed what she suspected. The spleen was compromised. She needed an OR, and she needed it in the next 30 minutes. She climbed back out of the helicopter and found Holt standing 3 feet away, watching her with that same controlled expression that gave nothing away and somehow communicated everything. "He needs surgery," she said. "Real surgery, not field management. The abdominal wound has to be addressed. I can stabilize him enough for transport, but transport to where? Nearest level 1 trauma center is 45 minutes by ground. 22 minutes by air," Holt said. "Then why is he here and not there?" "Because he can't go there," Holt said, and the flatness in his voice told her that this was a wall she wasn't going to get through by pressing directly. Barnes's presence on U.S. soil in his current condition cannot be documented. The moment he enters a civilian trauma center, there are forms, records, questions about how he was injured. "So you brought him to a community ER in the middle of nowhere to keep it quiet," Flora said. She heard her own voice and was surprised by how steady it was, given what she was feeling. "You brought him to me specifically because I'm already off the books, because using me doesn't create a paper trail." Holt didn't deny it. That was almost worse. "You have an OR here," he said. "Small, but functional. I checked." "You checked," she repeated. "When did you check, Raymond? How long have you been watching this hospital?" "Flora." "How long?" He met her eyes. 14 months. The number hit her like something physical. 14 months. For 14 months, she had walked these hallways thinking she was invisible, thinking she had finally gotten free. And for 14 months, there had been eyes on her, notes being taken, her routines cataloged by people who work for the man standing in front of her. She felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been held in careful suspension for 3 years, beginning to move. "We need to discuss this," she said. "I know." "Later," she said, because Barnes was dying and everything else was later. "Right now I need Marsh, and I need your soldiers out of my OR." She turned and walked back into the hospital, and the fury walked with her, contained and cold and useful, the way she had learned to make every difficult emotion useful, because the alternative was letting it slow her down. Inside, the ER had settled into a tense, strange calm. The soldiers had pulled back to the perimeter, as Holt had apparently ordered, and the medical staff was clustered near the nurses' station in a tight, frightened group. Sandra had her arms crossed and her jaw set. Two of the overnight orderlies looked like they were considering whether the supply closet was a reasonable place to spend the rest of their shift. Marsh met Flora in the middle of the room. He had clearly been doing some rapid internal processing since she'd walked out, because the stunned confusion on his face had resolved into something more purposeful, if still deeply unsettled. "Talk to me," he said quietly. "Incoming critical. Male, early 40s. GSW to the right chest and left upper quadrant. We have a chest tube in, repositioned and functioning. Oxygen sats improving. The abdominal wound is the priority. I believe we're looking at a splenic laceration with a retained round. His pressure is dropping." Marsh absorbed this without flinching. Whatever else he was, tired, rumpled, taped together glasses and all, he was a physician. And when someone handed him a clinical picture, the physician took over. "Our OR is not equipped for a splenectomy. I'm a general practitioner with ER experience. I'm not a surgeon." "I am," Flora said quietly. Marsh stared at her. "I'm not licensed to practice surgery in this state under this name," she said, holding his gaze. "And I understand if that is a line you can't cross. But I am telling you, I have the training. I have performed this procedure under conditions significantly worse than what we have available to us tonight. I can do this. And if I don't, he will be dead in 20 to 40 minutes. The ER was very quiet. Flora was aware that Sandra was listening. She was aware that the two orderlies were listening. She was aware that one of Holt's soldiers had drifted slightly closer to the nurse's station than he was supposed to be. Marsh took his glasses off, looked at the taped hinge, and put them back on. It was, she understood, his version of a pause button. If you're wrong about any of this, your training, your capability, that man dies on my table in my hospital. Yes, she said, he does. And if you're right, he has a chance. Another pause. Marsh looked past her toward the entrance, where Holt was visible through the glass, standing with the absolute stillness of a man who had learned not to show how desperately he needed something. Who is he? Marsh said. The patient. Someone who deserves to live, Flora said. That's genuinely the most honest answer I can give you right now. Marsh nodded once, a short, decisive movement. OR2, give me 5 minutes to prep. He walked away, already pulling his phone from his pocket, calling in the OR nurse, rearranging the pieces of what should have been an impossible situation into something workable, the way good doctors always did. Flora watched him go and felt a rush of something that might, in a less pressured moment, have been gratitude. Then Sandra was beside her, and the look on Sandra's face was not frightened anymore. It was something harder and more direct than fear. Flora, Sandra said, I need you to look at me. Flora looked at her. Are you a nurse? Sandra said. Are you actually a nurse, or have I been working next to someone who... I'm a nurse, Flora said. That part is real. The training is real. Everything you've seen me do in this ER for the last 3 years, that was real. I am not a danger to any patient who has ever been in my care. Sandra, I need you to believe that. Sandra studied her for a long moment. Her eyes were the eyes of a woman who had raised children, who had worked a night shift at a community ER for 11 years, who had developed an extremely precise instrument for detecting when someone was telling the truth and when they weren't. You're also something else, Sandra said. Yes, Flora said. I'm also something else. Something to do with those helicopters. Yes. And that man outside with the gun. Flora felt her jaw tighten. Yes, Sandra exhaled through her nose, a long, steady breath. Is our staff safe? My people, our patients, are we safe? Yes, Flora said, and this time she put everything she had behind it. I will make sure of that, I promise you. Sandra held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she said, what do you need from me? And that right there, was why Flora had stayed in this town, in this hospital. Beside this woman, she was only now realizing she had come to trust more than almost anyone else in her carefully limited world. I need you to manage the ER while I'm in the OR, Flora said. Keep the patients calm. If anyone asks what's happening, the story is emergency trauma protocol, need to know. And if any soldier, any one of them, tries to come past the OR door, you call me immediately. You understand? Understood, Sandra said, and she was already moving. Flora turned back toward the entrance and pushed through the doors to where Holt was waiting. We're ready to move him, she said. I need your best 2 soldiers to assist with the stretcher transfer, and I need Corporal Reyes inside the OR with me. She knows his recent vitals better than anyone. Done, Holt said. He signaled, and the movement began. The careful, practiced choreography of moving a critical patient. Every person in the chain knowing their role. The stretcher rolling across the pavement with Reyes maintaining the IV line and monitoring his SATs on the portable unit. As they moved, Flora fell into step beside Holt and said, her voice low enough that only he could hear, the soldiers in the parking lot, what are they there for? Not for Barnes, not for me. There's something else. Holt glanced at her sideways, a quick assessing look. Tell me, she said, if there's a threat to this hospital or the people in it, I need to know right now. Holt was quiet for 4 steps. 5. Then, the team that compromised Barnes's extraction. We have reason to believe they followed the helicopters. Flora's steps didn't slow. So they're out there. Possibly. We have perimeter security. My people are the best. Raymond. She said his name the way you say something when you are done with the comfortable version and need the real one. How many? Unknown. Estimate. Between 4 and 8, he said. Armed, motivated, and aware that Barnes is still alive. Flora processed this without visible reaction, which was, she was aware, its own kind of reaction. The kind that came from training so deep it had become reflex. Somewhere in the parking lot, in the darkness beyond the reach of the helicopter lights, there were people who wanted Barnes dead, and she had just walked him into a building with 1 functioning OR, 2 nurses, and a physician with taped glasses. You should have told me that before I agreed to anything, she said. If I'd told you that before you agreed, Holt said, you would have run. She wanted to tell him he was wrong. She found she couldn't, quite. They brought Barnes through the ER, Sandra and the orderlies clearing a path, the soldiers keeping tight formation. And Flora walked ahead of the stretcher, her mind already inside the OR, already sequencing the steps, already running the calculus of what she had available and what she needed and how to close the gap between the two. Marsh was waiting, gloved and gowned, his broken glasses replaced, somehow, miraculously, by a spare pair from his coat pocket that were only slightly less damaged. 2 OR nurses flanked him. The overhead lights were up full. We're ready, he said. Flora took the gown from the instrument tray, shrugged into it, and held out her hands for gloves. Talk me through your inventory. What do we have? They had enough. Not everything she would have wanted, not the resources of an equipped surgical suite, but enough. She had worked with less. She had worked in a forward operating base in conditions she still couldn't describe in polite company, and brought people back who should have been beyond bringing back. She looked down at Michael Barnes on the table, at the gray, exhausted lines of his face, at the chest rising and falling with more stability now than 20 minutes ago, and she let herself, for just 1 second, remember who he was. Not a mission, not a file, not a tactical asset, a person she had known in a different life before everything had gone wrong. A person who, whatever his flaws, and he had them, substantial ones, had once, in a cold and terrible place, put himself between her and something that would have killed her. She owed him this. Whatever else was complicated, that was not. Scalpel, she said, and her voice was steady, and her hands were steady, and the OR was quiet except for the sound of the monitors and the careful, purposeful movement of people working at the edge of what they could do. Outside in the parking lot, the soldiers on the perimeter were watching the darkness. And in the darkness, something was watching back. The first incision took 11 seconds. Flora knew because she counted. She always counted in the OR, not obsessively, not the way anxiety counted, but the way a pilot reads instruments. Steady, automatic, a running clock beneath every other thought. 11 seconds for the incision. 40 seconds to identify and control the primary bleed. She worked with the kind of focused silence that made the room feel smaller, more concentrated, as if everyone inside it had unconsciously pulled closer to the center of gravity she created. Marsh stood across from her, retracting tissue, following her lead with the quiet adaptability of a man who understood his role had shifted. He was not the authority in this room anymore. He knew it. He didn't fight it. That, she decided, said something important about him. Corporal Reyes called vitals from the head of the table every 90 seconds. Pressure still low, but holding. Sats at 93. Heart rate elevated but regular. Barnes was fighting, which was the most important thing. She had known men who simply stopped fighting on the table, not because the wounds were unsurvivable, but because something in them decided the math wasn't worth it anymore. Barnes had never been that kind of man. Pressure is dropping, Reyes said. 82/48. He's losing more volume, Flora said, not looking up. I can see it. The laceration is larger than I estimated from the outside. I need suction here, and I need it now. The OR nurse moved. Flora worked. For the next 4 minutes, the only sounds were the monitors, the instruments, and the occasional terse exchange of medical shorthand that would have been incomprehensible to anyone outside the room. Then Barnes's heart monitor spiked, not flatlined, spiked, a sudden arrhythmic lurch that made Reyes straighten sharply and made the OR nurse take a fast step toward the crash cart. He's going into V-TAC, Reyes said, her voice controlled but tight. I see it, Flora said. She did not stop working. Give him 100 of lidocaine IV push, now, and tell me his temperature. 95.4, hypothermia, 3 hours of blood loss, fluid replacement without warming. His core temperature had dropped, and a cold heart was an irritable heart. Flora filed this, adjusted, kept moving. We need warm fluids. Everything going in needs to be warm. Whatever you have to do to make that happen, make it happen. The lidocaine went in. The monitor lurched, stuttered, and then 8 seconds that felt considerably longer, smoothed back into a rhythm that was too fast but no longer dangerous. Marsh exhaled. Good Lord. Stay with me, Flora said, to him and to Barnes both. She found the splenic laceration 2 minutes later, a jagged tear along the lower pole, actively bleeding, and her hands moved to control it with the automatic precision of someone who had done this in environments where the table shook and the lights went out and nobody came to help. She clamped, sutured, checked, clamped again. Methodical, relentless. It was while she was working on the second layer of sutures that the radio on Reyes's belt crackled. It was a short burst, static-edged, but Flora caught the words clearly enough. Perimeter breach, east side, 2 contacts. Her hands did not stop moving, but every other part of her went very, very alert. Reyes looked at her across the table. Flora gave a single, small shake of her head. Not now, keep going, do not let this room fall apart. And Reyes pressed the radio down against her thigh to muffle any further transmissions. They had maybe minutes, maybe less. The people Holt had warned her about, the ones who had followed the helicopters, who knew Barnes was still alive, had just breached the hospital perimeter on the east side, which put them approximately 40 yards from the ER entrance, which put them significantly closer to where she was standing than she would have liked. She kept suturing. Marsh, she said quietly. I heard it, he said, equally quiet. How many exits from this OR? 1, the door we came in. Windows? 1, it doesn't open from the inside. She processed this. Okay, when I tell you to, I need you to take Reyes and get our patient's vitals as stable as you can to move him. Can you manage an emergency transfer if it comes to that? Marsh's jaw tightened. I've never done an emergency OR transfer in the middle of... Can you manage it? She repeated. A beat. Yes. Good. She didn't say anything more about it. She went back to working because the surgery was not done, and Barnes needed her hands where they were, and panic was the one thing she absolutely could not afford to let into this room. Outside the OR, she heard raised voices. She couldn't make out words, but she recognized the pattern, that specific escalation of sound that happened when soldiers were transitioning from defensive positioning to active contact. Holt's people were engaging, which meant the breach was confirmed, and it was not a false alarm. The radio on Reyes's belt crackled again. This time the words were clearer. 2 down, 2 unaccounted. Be advised, they may have entered the building. Flora looked at Marsh. Now, she said, start prepping him to move. You're not done, Marsh said. The round is still... I've controlled the primary bleed. The round is stable. Leaving it in is safer than the alternative right now. She was already moving her hands to close, her technique shifting from meticulous to rapid without losing precision. He can survive with the round in place. He cannot survive if someone gets through that door. Marsh started calling instructions to the OR nurse in a low, urgent voice. Reyes was already adjusting lines, securing the chest tube, checking connections. The room became a controlled scramble, everyone moving fast, but not chaotically. The difference between trained people under pressure and untrained people under pressure. Flora placed the last suture, tied it, and straightened up. Pack and dress, quickly. Her hands came away from Barnes, and she stripped one glove, picked up a scalpel from the instrument tray, not because she planned to use it as a weapon, but because it was there, and she was not the kind of person who walked toward uncertain situations without something in her hand, and moved to the OR door. She cracked it open. The hallway was empty, but from the direction of the main ER, she could hear movement. The kind of careful, deliberate movement that someone makes when they are trying not to be heard and have not quite succeeded. She stepped into the hallway. At the far end, Sandra was pressed against the wall near the nurse's station, her face white, one hand raised toward Flora in a gesture that could have meant stop or could have meant they're here, and the distinction mattered enormously. Flora held up 2 fingers, then pointed toward the ER entrance. Question, how many and where? Sandra held up 1 finger, then pointed at the supply corridor, the same corridor where Flora had hidden less than 2 hours ago. 1 contact, supply corridor. Flora moved. She went along the opposite wall, staying low, using the room's geography the way she'd been trained. Not running, not freezing, just moving with the kind of controlled economy that made her almost silent. She reached the junction of the main corridor and the supply corridor and stopped. She heard breathing, shallow, slightly elevated, someone trying to stay quiet who wasn't quite managing it. She thought about her options in the space of 1 breath. She had a scalpel. The person in that corridor almost certainly had significantly more than a scalpel. Engaging directly was not the play, but letting them reach the OR was also not the play. She did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She made herself sound frightened. "Hello?" she called out, in a voice that cracked slightly, that had the exact quality of a civilian nurse who was scared and not thinking clearly. "Is someone there? I'm a nurse. I'm just trying to get to my patients. Please don't." Movement in the supply corridor. A figure stepped into the junction. He was wrong-footed, prepared for a silent target, not a frightened woman talking at him. And in that half-second of recalibration, Flora threw the scalpel. Not at him, but past his face, close enough to feel the air move. And while his eyes tracked it, his body turned, and she stepped in and hit him with a palm strike to the throat that was not gentle and was not intended to be. He went down. He went down faster than she expected, which told her the palm strike had landed better than she'd aimed for, which was either skill or luck, and she was not going to examine which one tonight. She took his weapon, a compact tactical sidearm, which she checked and safed in under 4 seconds, and looked up to find Sandra standing 10 feet away, staring at her with an expression that had moved well past stunned and into something that might, eventually, become a kind of awe. "Who are you?" Sandra said. It was not quite the same question she'd asked earlier. It was quieter, and it had more weight. "I'll explain everything," Flora said. "I promise. Right now I need zip ties or anything equivalent. I need to secure this man, and I need you to find Colonel Holt and tell him we have one in custody in the supply corridor." Sandra nodded, sharp and immediate, and moved. Flora zip-tied the man's wrists with cable ties from the supply shelving, close enough, checked his pulse, confirmed he was breathing adequately, and stood up. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She walked back to the OR and pushed through the door and found Barnes on the stretcher, partially prepped for movement, with Marsh standing at the foot of it, looking like a man who had passed through several different emotional states in the last 10 minutes and not particularly enjoyed any of them. "He's stable enough to move," Marsh said. "Barely, but stable." "Good, we're not moving him yet. The immediate threat is contained." She put the sidearm down on the instrument tray, a surreal juxtaposition that made the OR nurse press back slightly against the far wall, and pulled her glove back on. "I need to finish what I started." "You just—" Marsh stopped. He looked at the door she'd come through, then back at her. "In the hallway, that was—" "Later," she said. "Scalpel." He handed her the scalpel. He did not ask any more questions. She went back to work. It was while she was completing the final closure that Holt came through the OR door, and the look on his face when he saw her standing there, gloved, working, a secured sidearm on the instrument tray beside her, was something she chose not to interpret in the moment because it was too complicated and she didn't have the bandwidth. "3 contacts total," he said from the doorway, keeping his voice low enough not to disturb the work. "2 are down on the perimeter. Your one in the supply corridor is our 3rd. Building is clear." "Any casualties?" she said without looking up. "One of my soldiers took a round to the vest. He's winded but intact." "Send him to me when I'm done here." Holt nodded. Then, "Flora," she kept working. "What?" "You need to know something." He came 2 steps into the OR, far enough that she could see his face. "The 3 men outside, we identified one of them. He's not affiliated with the group that compromised Barnes's extraction." Flora's hands did not stop, but her attention shifted entirely. "Then who is he affiliated with?" Holt was quiet for 1 second too long. "Raymond," she said. "He's one of ours," Holt said. "Was one of ours. An operator who went dark 8 months ago. We thought he was dead." Flora placed the last suture and tied it and looked up. "You brought a compromised extraction to my location, and one of the people who followed you here is a former SOCOM operator who you thought was dead." "Yes." "Who knew this location?" "The location wasn't in any file he could have accessed," Holt said, "which means someone gave it to him." The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the muffled sound of soldiers on the perimeter, the distant whir of rotors idling down. Inside, the monitors tracked Barnes's heartbeat, steadier now, slower, more purposeful. He was stabilizing. He was going to make it through the night. "Someone inside your operation," Flora said. "Yes. Someone who knew you were coming here, who knew about me." "Yes." She pulled off her gloves and dropped them on the tray. She turned to face Holt fully, and she let him see, for the first time in this long and grinding night, what was actually behind her eyes. Not the controlled, contained competence he'd been receiving since she stepped out of the supply corridor. The thing underneath it, the part that was tired and furious and had been carrying a weight for 3 years that should have been distributed differently. "You told me 14 months, she said. "You've been watching this hospital for 14 months. Before tonight, How many people inside your command knew where I was? Holt's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. 3. Myself, my deputy, and the analyst who tracked you. And now someone who followed your helicopters here knows exactly where I am, she said, which means my cover is blown regardless of what happens next, which means Clover Falls is done. The weight of that sat in the room for a moment. 3 years. 3 years of careful construction, of making herself forgettable, of night shifts and ordinary conversations, and the specific loneliness of a life lived at a deliberate distance from anyone who might come to know her too well. Done. Burned. As of tonight. I know, Holt said. You don't seem surprised, she said. He held her gaze. I'm not. And there it was. The thing she'd been sensing since he turned that corner in the hallway and looked at her with relief instead of triumph. She had been reading the situation wrong, not because she was wrong about the details, but because she'd been assuming the frame was what he'd presented it as. A retrieval operation, an emergency extraction, a desperate man coming to her because she was the only one who could save Barnes. All of those things were true, and underneath all of them was something else. You needed this to happen, she said slowly. You needed my cover to break. You needed me to surface. Holt didn't answer immediately. The silence was its own answer. Barnes was real, she said. It was not quite a question. She needed it confirmed anyway. Barnes is real, he said. Everything about his condition is real. I did not manufacture a dying man to draw you out, Flora. I want you to believe that. She studied him. She had always been good at reading Holt, even when she hated what she was reading. He was telling the truth about Barnes. She was certain of it. But, she said, he said, if I had tried to contact you through any other method, a message, a phone call, a letter, you would have run. You'd built 3 separate exit plans into this location. I know because we found them. The vehicle in the lot behind the pharmacy, the cash and documents in the safety deposit box in Eugene. The third option I'm still not entirely sure about, but I suspect involves a boat. She said nothing. I needed you to not run, he said, and I needed something that was important enough that you wouldn't. Barnes, she said, and the truth, he said, about what happened 3 years ago, about why you faked your death, about what was done to you and who ordered it. He paused. About why I let it happen. The monitors beeped. Reyes was making quiet adjustments at the head of the table. Marsh had stepped back to the far side of the room with a particular discretion of a man who understood he was witnessing something that predated and outweighed everything happening tonight. Flora felt the weight of that last sentence settle into her the way heavy things settle, slowly, finding its level, displacing everything else. Why I let it happen? In 3 years, she had imagined many versions of this conversation. She had imagined anger and denial and the careful bureaucratic deflection that people in Holt's position had elevated to an art form. She had not imagined this. Acknowledgement, direct and unqualified, standing in a half-equipped OR in Oregon, while a man they'd both tried to keep alive breathed steadily on the table between them. She breathed in slowly, out slowly. How long do we have before the man in the supply corridor is missed? She said. His check-in window is 22 minutes from now, Holt said. Then we have 22 minutes before whoever sent him knows this location is blown and decides what to do next. She reached up and pulled the OR cap from her head. Her hair fell loose around her face, and she became, for just a moment, less the combat medic and more the woman, tired, exposed, standing at the edge of something she hadn't chosen and couldn't avoid. I'm listening, she said. Talk fast, tell me everything. Who inside your command sold me out 3 years ago? Who sent the man in my hallway tonight? And what you need from me that you couldn't ask for any other way? Holt looked at her across the body of the man they had both, in their separate ways, been trying to protect. Then he started talking. and what he said changed everything she thought she knew about why she had run. Holt's voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this conversation so many times in his head that the words had worn smooth, like river stones. But his eyes were not smooth. His eyes were the eyes of someone paying a debt they'd been carrying too long. 3 years ago, he said, the operation that burned you was not a failure of intelligence. It was not a mistake in the field. It was deliberate. Someone inside the command structure fed your position to a hostile network 22 minutes before the extraction window. 22 minutes. Enough time to position, not enough time for us to abort cleanly. He stopped. You already knew it wasn't an accident. I knew, Flora said. What you didn't know, he said, is who gave the order. And it wasn't someone at the operational level. It wasn't a handler or an analyst who got turned or got greedy. It was a general officer. The OR was very quiet. Barnes's monitor kept its steady rhythm. Brigadier General Carl Whitmore, Holt said. Flora heard the name and felt something inside her go absolutely still. Not shocked, she had, in the long, sleepless architecture of the past 3 years, assembled a list of possible names, and Whitmore had been on it. But hearing it stated plainly, without qualification, in the flat, declarative tone of confirmed fact rather than suspicion, was different from suspecting it. Confirmation had a weight that suspicion never did. Whitmore, she said. He had a financial relationship with a private defense contractor, one of the groups Barnes was running intelligence against. Barnes was getting close to something that would have destroyed that relationship and taken Whitmore down with it. You were Barnes's support asset. Burning you bought Whitmore time. Holt's jaw was tight. It also, as it turned out, bought him 3 years, because Barnes lost the intelligence thread when you disappeared and the investigation stalled. And you, Flora said, where were you when this decision was made? The question landed the way she intended it to. Not as an accusation exactly, but not as one either. Holt was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted. I was told you were dead, he said. I was told the extraction failed and you were KIA, body unrecoverable. I believed it for 11 months. He met her eyes. And then I found a discrepancy in a logistics report, a small one, the kind of thing that gets buried in paperwork unless you're looking for it. A medical supply requisition from a civilian hospital in the Pacific Northwest that matched a very specific supply pattern, the kind of pattern someone with your training would use to stock a location they intended to shelter in for a long time. Flora said nothing. She remembered that requisition. She remembered thinking at the time that it was too specific, that she should have varied the pattern, and then telling herself she was being paranoid. She had not been paranoid enough. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found, Holt said. Not Whitmore, not my deputy, nobody. I started watching the hospital, and the longer I watched, the more certain I became that you hadn't just survived. You'd run. Which meant you knew, which meant you were smarter than whoever had tried to burn you, and you'd gotten out before they could finish the job. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite categorize. I was relieved, and then I was furious, and then I started trying to figure out how to fix it without getting you killed in the process. And Barnes, Flora said, his extraction being compromised tonight, that wasn't random either. No, Holt said. Barnes had rebuilt the intelligence thread. He was 3 days from delivering a package that would have handed us Whitmore on a plate. Someone inside the command tipped Whitmore. Whitmore moved to eliminate Barnes before the package could be delivered. He paused. The operator you neutralized in the supply corridor, he was Whitmore's man. So were the two on the perimeter. Flora turned this over, examining it from every angle the way she examined every piece of information that arrived in a moment of high stress. Looking for the weakness, the place where it didn't hold. She couldn't find one. The architecture was sound. It was also, she realized with a clarity that arrived like cold water, significantly more dangerous than she'd understood when she first stepped out of that supply corridor. If Whitmore sent 3 operators here tonight, she said, He knows this location. He knows Barnes is alive. He knows I surfaced. Yes. And when his men missed their check-in, she checked the clock on the OR wall, 16 minutes, he'll know the operation failed. Yes. Which means he'll send more. Almost certainly, Holt said. Flora looked at him steadily. How many people does Whitmore have access to? Enough that staying in this building past 0200 is not something I would recommend. It was 0137, 23 minutes. She looked at Barnes. She looked at the monitors. His pressure had climbed to 94/61. Not good, but functional, and trending upward. His SATs were at 94%. His heart rate was 102, elevated but stable. He had been through surgery in a community OR with inadequate supplies, managed by a nurse practitioner working outside her legal scope, and a general practitioner who had never assisted in abdominal surgery. And he was alive and improving, and the stubbornness of that felt like something personal. Can he be moved? She said to Marsh, who had been standing against the far wall with the very deliberate stillness of a man who understood that what he was hearing was classified and was choosing, consciously, not to process it until later. Marsh came forward and checked the monitors, checked the dressing, checked the chest tube. He took his time. Flora did not rush him. Moving him in the next 20 minutes is a significant risk, Marsh said. His pressure is fragile. If we hit turbulence, if the transfer is rough, if the chest tube shifts again, what percentage do you put on him surviving another attack on this building? Flora said. Marsh looked at her. He looked at Holt. He looked back at her. 0, he said. Then moving him is the better risk, she said. I need your 2 best orderlies, and I need the portable monitor secured to the stretcher. Reyes, you're with him every step. You don't leave his side for any reason. If his SATs drop below 88, you call me immediately, regardless of what I'm doing. Yes, ma'am, Reyes said, and there was something in the ma'am that Flora chose not to examine right now because it made something tighten in her chest that she couldn't afford. She walked out of the OR and found Sandra in the hallway. Sandra, who had been managing the ER for the past 40 minutes under conditions that no union contract had ever anticipated, who had kept the ambulatory patients calm and the staff functioning, and had, apparently, also located cable ties in the supply closet with the efficiency of someone who kept their head when everything around them was losing theirs. Sandra, Flora said, I need to tell you something. Okay, Sandra said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were steady. 3 years of working beside this woman, and Flora was only now fully seeing what was there. The kind of quiet, unshakable competence that didn't announce itself. This hospital is going to have more unwanted visitors in the next 20 to 40 minutes, Flora said. I need you to get every patient who can be moved to the interior rooms away from the exterior walls. Anyone who cannot be moved, I need them low. Beds at the lowest position, staff with them. And I need you to call the Clover Falls Police Department. Sandra blinked. The police? Shouldn't the military be handling? The military is compromised, Flora said, because there was no time for a gentler version. I don't know who outside of this building I can trust tonight. Local police are outside the chain of command that created this problem. They won't stop what's coming, but they'll complicate it, and complication buys time. Sandra absorbed this without visible collapse, which continued to impress Flora enormously. What do I tell them? Armed intruders, ongoing situation. Request immediate response and ask them to notify the county sheriff. She put a hand briefly on Sandra's arm, a contact she didn't usually permit herself, but tonight was not a usual night. You've been remarkable. I need you to be remarkable for a little longer. Sandra nodded once, sharp, and pulled out her phone. Flora turned back toward the ER. Holt was waiting. He had, she noticed, shed the administrative exterior and was now standing the way he stood when he was operational. Weight forward, hands loose, eyes moving. I've repositioned my people on the south and west sides, he said. If Whitmore sends a second team, they'll come from the east. It's the lowest visibility approach, and it's where the first team came from. I know, Flora said. I mapped this building. What assets do you have left? 7 soldiers. 1 is injured. Effectively 6. 6 soldiers, 7 if we count Reyes. She did the math. Against a second team of unknown size sent by a general officer who is currently motivated to eliminate every person in this building who knows what Barnes was carrying. That's the situation, Holt said. What was Barnes carrying? She said. What's in the package? I need to know. Flora, if I'm going to fight for it, I need to know what it is, she said. That's not a negotiation, Raymond. That's a condition. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, financial records. 14 transactions over 3 years between Whitmore and a shell company controlled by an adversarial state actor. Proof of payments totaling $11 million. And recordings, audio recordings of Whitmore providing classified operational details during those transactions. Names of assets, locations of forward operating positions, including... He stopped. Including what? Flora said. Including yours, he said. Your operational identity, your position, your extraction window, all of it, on a recording in Whitmore's voice, being handed over for money. Flora stood very still. He sold you, Holt said. Not incidentally, not as collateral damage, specifically. You were one of the things he sold. She had known this, in the way you know things that you cannot afford to fully feel until the moment allows it. She had known it in her bones during the night she ran, during the months of silence after, during every careful, ordinary day in Clover Falls, when she had looked over her shoulder at nothing and still not been able to make herself stop looking. Her body had known. She had just never had confirmation. She had it now. Where is the package? She said. Her voice was level. She was proud of how level it was. Barnes had it on him when he was extracted, Holt said. It's a data drive. It should be. In the helicopter, she said, with his personal effects. Yes, my deputy has it secured in helicopter 2. Flora turned without another word and walked toward the ER entrance. Holt fell into step beside her. What are you doing? Finishing this, she said. She came through the ER doors and the night hit her again. Colder now. The helicopters mostly idled down, the parking lot lit by the harsh white lights of the aircraft's exterior panels. The soldiers Holt had repositioned were visible at intervals around the building's perimeter, their attention pointed outward into the darkness. The darkness was quiet. 15 minutes until Whitmore's team missed their check-in. Possibly less if he was running them on a tighter protocol than standard. She crossed to helicopter 2. Holt's deputy, a compact, serious-faced woman named Captain Alves, whom Flora had not met before tonight, was standing at the cargo door with the particular watchfulness of someone guarding something important. The drive, Flora said. Alves looked at Holt. Give it to her, Holt said. Alves reached into a sealed evidence bag and produced a drive the size of a thumb, matte black, unremarkable. She held it out. Flora took it, turned it over in her fingers. This was what a man had nearly died for. This was what Whitmore had sold $11 million of American lives and intelligence to suppress. It weighed almost nothing. This needs to be transmitted, Flora said. Not delivered physically, transmitted. To someone outside Whitmore's chain of command, with enough reach that it can't be buried. She looked at Holt. Who do you have? There's a Senate oversight contact, Holt said carefully. Someone Barnes was working with, outside the command structure entirely. If we can reach them, then reach them, Flora said. Right now, not in the morning, not after extraction, right now before Whitmore knows this operation failed and starts burning files. I need a secure terminal to Hospital Administrator's Office, she said. Secure enough for our purposes, and it's on the interior of the building. Let's go. She was already moving. Behind her, she heard Holt speak quietly to Alves, instructions she didn't fully catch. and then his footsteps catching up to hers. They were 20 feet from the ER entrance when the radio on Holt's vest crackled, sharp and urgent. "Colonel, East Side, multiple contacts. I count 6, possibly 8. They're not slowing down." Flora stopped walking. 6 to 8, against their 6. And Barnes was still being prepped for movement inside. She turned to Holt. "How long to transmit?" 8 minutes if the connection is clean." "Then you transmit," she said. "I'll buy you 8 minutes." Holt stared at her. "Flora, you are not a soldier. You are one person with a sidearm you took off an unconscious man 40 minutes ago." "I'm also someone who knows this building better than anyone out there," she said. "Every corridor, every exit, every room. I've been mapping it for 3 years. That matters." She pressed the drive into his hand. "Go. Administrator's office, 2nd floor, door on the left. Go now." "I am not leaving you out here." "You're not leaving me," she said. "You're transmitting. There's a difference." She pulled the sidearm and checked the magazine. 9 rounds. Raymond. She said his name differently than she had all night. Not as a title, not as a boundary, just as a name. The way you say someone's name when you want them to understand that you are being completely serious. If that drive doesn't get transmitted tonight, Whitmore walks. Everything Barnes almost died for, everything I've been running from for 3 years, it disappears. That's not acceptable to me. Go. He looked at her for 2 seconds. 3. She watched him calculate the same way she calculated, weighing variables against outcomes. And she watched the moment he arrived at the same answer she had. 8 minutes, he said. "I'll be here," she said. He ran. Flora turned toward the east side of the building. She had 8 minutes and 9 rounds and 3 years of memorized floor plans, and the particular cold clarity that came, she had learned long ago, not from the absence of fear, but from the decision to move through it anyway. She radioed Holt's lead soldier, a staff sergeant named Kowalski, no relation to Sandra, who had been running the perimeter with the focused professionalism of someone who did not require motivation, and said, "Kowalski, east side approach. I need your people spread. Don't bunch. Make them think they're facing more than they are." "Ma'am, with respect, the colonel's orders were—" "The colonel's orders are to transmit," Flora said. "He's transmitting. I'm covering the approach. Are you with me or not?" A half-second pause. "With you, ma'am." "Good. Spread your people 20 feet apart along the east wall. Anyone who reaches the building, your job is to slow them, not stop them. Drive them left, toward the service entrance. I'll be at the service entrance." "Copy." She moved to the service entrance at a pace that was just short of running, controlled, purposeful, and took up a position inside the door, in the shadow where the exterior light didn't reach, and she waited. She thought about Barnes on the stretcher. She thought about Sandra on the phone with the police department. She thought about Marsh, who had walked into tonight as a tired ER doctor and was ending it as something she didn't have a category for yet. She thought about Holt's hands on the administrator's desk, working a connection to a Senate oversight contact who was probably asleep right now and was about to have a very significant change of plans. She thought briefly about the life she had built here and was now watching end. The apartment with the 2 escape routes and the go bag under the floorboard, the shifts at Mercy Ridge, the patience, the routine that had felt like confinement and was now, she realized, only in the moment of losing it, something she'd been quietly grateful for. The ordinary, unremarkable shape of it, the safety she had carved out of silence. She let herself feel the loss of it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she heard voices outside, short, clipped, the communication style of a trained team moving to a target, and she let the feeling go and became the other version of herself, the one she'd been trying to put away for 3 years. The service door opened. The first man through was moving fast and hadn't fully adjusted to the interior light, and Flora stepped in before he completed the transition and drove an elbow into his jaw with the full rotation of her body behind it. He dropped. She caught his weapon on the way down, clearing the doorway in the same movement, and the second man through the door saw her and hesitated. A fraction of a second, barely anything, but it was enough. She was already moving, already inside his reach, and she fought with the economy of someone who had been trained to end things quickly, because drawn-out fights in close quarters were how good people died. He went down. The third man didn't come through the door. She heard him radio instead, pulling back, regrouping, which meant he was calling it in, which meant Whitmore was about to know the second attempt had also failed, which meant the window for everything she just bought was closing. She keyed her radio. Kowalski, status. East approach stalled. 2 contacts down, 3 withdrew. I think they're pulling back. They're regrouping, Flora said. Don't let your guard down. She checked the clock on her phone. 5 minutes and 40 seconds since she'd sent Holt inside. She pressed herself against the wall and breathed steadily and waited. At 6 minutes and 51 seconds, Holt's voice came through the radio, and she had never in her life been so relieved to hear Raymond Holt's voice. It's done, he said. Transmitted and confirmed received. We have an acknowledgement. Flora closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, she keyed the radio and said, Everyone inside. Now, we move Barnes to the aircraft and we get out of here before whoever is left out there decides to stop being careful. She walked back through the service corridor, through the ER, past the shell-shocked faces of the overnight staff, past the patients who had been moved and lowered, and who were watching the night with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of people who had come to a hospital for ordinary reasons and received something else entirely, and into the main entrance where the stretcher was waiting, Barnes strapped in, Reyes at his side, Marsh standing with his arms crossed and his taped glasses slightly askew, and the expression of a man who had just survived something he did not yet have language for. He's ready, Marsh said. Vitals are the best they've been all night. Good, Flora said. Thank you, Alan. It was the first time she had called him by his first name in 3 years of working beside him. She watched it land on his face, the surprise of it, and then something warmer underneath. Are you coming back? He said. She looked at him. She thought about how to answer that and decided the only honest answer was, I don't know. He nodded slowly. Well, he said, and then stopped and started again. It has been, unquestionably, the most extraordinary night of my career. He put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, and he held it for a moment longer than a professional handshake required. And she understood that he was trying to tell her something that neither of them had the right words for. Then she let go and turned and walked through the ER doors for what she already knew, on some level, would be the last time. The parking lot was controlled chaos. Soldiers loading into aircraft, the wounded man assisted by 2 others, Reyes and the orderlies moving Barnes's stretcher across the pavement with the careful urgency of people who understood every bump mattered. The helicopters were spooling up. The rotor wash was building. Holt met her at the edge of the movement and fell into step beside her. Senate contact is flagging Whitmore's accounts as of 30 minutes from now, he said. Military police will be at his residence by 0400. He has nowhere to go. He has resources, Flora said. Not anymore, Holt said. The transmission included his financial network. We took it all down in one signal. He paused. It's over, Flora. The thing that made you run. It's over. She kept walking. She could feel the truth of it trying to settle into her, and she kept it at a distance for now, because there was still Barnes to load and still rotors to clear, and the part of her that had been running the perimeter of this night was not yet ready to stand down. Where does the aircraft take him? She said. Walter Reed. Surgical team is being prepped now. He'll have everything he needs. I want updates, she said. Real ones, not summaries. You'll have them. They reached helicopter 2. Barnes was being loaded, the stretcher locking into the aircraft mount with a solid mechanical click that was somehow reassuring. the sound of things being secured. Reyes climbed in after him without being asked. A good medic, Flora thought. Barnes was lucky. Holt touched her arm. Lightly, barely contact. "There's a seat for you," he said, "if you want it." She looked at him. "In the aircraft." "In what comes next," he said. "There's going to be a process. Whitmore's prosecution, the investigation into the network he built, the operational review of what was done to you. You don't have to navigate that alone." She looked out at the darkness beyond the parking lot, the darkness that had held Whitmore's men and now held only the night, quiet and empty, as if none of it had happened. She thought about what she was leaving. She thought about what she would be returning to. Not the life she'd had before, not exactly, because that life had been burned by someone else's decision and you could not uncurl smoke. But something, a version of herself that didn't have to be invisible, that didn't have to keep track of exits. Her hands were steady. They were, and had always been, steady. "One condition," she said. "Name it," Holt said. "The conversation we haven't finished yet," she said. "About your choices 3 years ago. About what you let happen and why. That conversation happens in full. No debriefing format, no official record. Just the truth." He met her eyes. "Agreed." She looked at him for one more moment, measuring, the way she measured everything. Not out of distrust exactly, but out of the habit of someone who had learned that the cost of misreading people was too high to pay twice. Then she climbed into the helicopter. Barnes was breathing. Reyes had 2 fingers on his pulse and was counting. The monitor was beeping in its steady, reliable rhythm. Outside, the rotors were accelerating, the ground beginning to fall away from the skids as the aircraft lifted. Flora sat across from Barnes and watched his face. In sleep, in near death, in the stripped-down vulnerability of the operating table, a person looked like what they actually were beneath everything else. Barnes looked, right now, like someone who had been fighting for a very long time and had not yet decided whether to stop. She knew that feeling. "Don't stop," she said quietly, not quite to him and not quite to herself. The helicopter lifted and the hospital fell away below them. The parking lot with its scattered light, the ER windows, the ordinary, unremarkable building where Flora Montgomery had spent 3 years learning to disappear. Getting smaller, getting further away. She did not look down for long. She looked forward, into the dark air ahead of them, and whatever was coming, she met it with steady hands and open eyes. The helicopter had been in the air for 11 minutes when Barnes opened his eyes. Not all the way, just a narrow strip of consciousness, enough for him to register the rotor noise above him, the IV in his arm, the weight of the oxygen mask over his face. Enough to register Flora sitting across from him, watching. His lips moved under the mask. She leaned forward. "Don't talk," she said. He moved his lips again. She lifted the edge of the mask slightly, just enough to hear. "You stayed," he said. His voice was barely a rasp, barely anything, but it carried. "Don't make it sentimental," she said. "You needed surgery. I was available." Something crossed his face that might, under better circumstances, have been a smile. "Liar," he said. She put the mask back. "Sleep," she said. "We're 40 minutes from Walter Reed." He closed his eyes. She sat back and looked at her hands, the hands that had held a scalpel in an undersupplied community OR less than 2 hours ago, that had driven an elbow into a man's jaw in a service corridor, that were now resting in her lap with the steadiness that had defined her entire adult life. She turned them over, palms up, examining them the way you examine something familiar that has just revealed a new quality. Across the aircraft, Holt was on a secure line. She could hear his voice beneath the rotor noise, clipped and deliberate, the voice he used when talking to people who outranked him but were currently depending on him. He met her eyes once over the phone, briefly, and she looked away first. Not out of discomfort, out of the decision to keep things compartmentalized for a little longer, because the conversation she and Holt still needed to have required ground under her feet and not 30 feet of night air. Reyes checked Barnes's vitals and called them across to Flora without being asked. Pressure up to 101/67. Sats at 95. Heart rate down to 88. He was climbing, slowly, stubbornly, in the particular way of someone whose body had decided it wasn't finished yet. Flora allowed herself, for the first time all night, to believe he was going to make it. Then Holt lowered the phone and said, "We have a problem." She looked at him. "Whitmore," he said. "He didn't wait for 0400. He's gone." Gone as in his vehicle left his residence 47 minutes ago. His personal security detail went with him. Destination unknown. Holt's voice was controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it. The specific frustration of a man who had been 3 moves ahead all night and had just discovered someone else had made a move he hadn't accounted for. He has access to a private aircraft. If he gets airborne before we can flag his tail number, he runs, Flora said. Yes. And the transmission, the Senate contact? The contact has the data. The investigation is already moving. But Whitmore in custody is not the same as Whitmore with the data circulating. If he gets out of the country before we can issue a formal hold, where would he go? Flora said. He has financial relationships in 3 countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States, Holt said. Any one of them. Flora was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Which airport is he most likely using?" Holt looked at her. "Flora, you are on an aircraft transporting a critical patient. You are not—" "Which airport, Raymond?" He held her gaze. She held his. Outside, the dark land moved below them, indifferent. "There's a private airfield," Holt said slowly, 40 miles northeast of D.C. He uses it for personal travel. It's within his residential radius, and it has minimal federal oversight. If he's moving fast and panicking, it's the most likely option. How far is it from Walter Reed? 31 miles. Flight time from our current position to Walter Reed? 26 minutes. She did the math. Whitmore had a 47-minute head start. Private airfield, 31 miles from the hospital. Depending on traffic, depending on how fast his security was driving, he was either already there or close to it. "Can you get someone to that airfield?" she said. "I have people who can be redirected." But Flora, authorization to detain a general officer requires— "He's a traitor," she said flatly. "He sold American assets to a hostile state actor for $11 million. He tried to have us killed tonight. How much authorization do you need?" Holt picked the phone back up. She watched him work. Rapid, decisive. The version of Raymond Holt that she had once, in a very different life, respected enormously before everything had become complicated. He was good at this. She had never disputed that. Being good at something and being trustworthy were different qualities, and she had, over the past 3 years, conflated them in ways that weren't entirely fair. She was beginning to understand that. She was also beginning to understand that the conversation she'd been dreading, the one about 3 years ago, about choices and silence, and the particular cowardice of letting something wrong happen because intervening was inconvenient, was going to be more complicated than she'd wanted it to be. Because the man she'd been carrying anger toward was not a simple man, and simple anger was easier. Barnes made a sound. Not distress, more like someone resettling in sleep, adjusting. Reyes checked him and gave Flora a small nod. Flora nodded back. Holt lowered the phone again. "I have a team 8 minutes from the airfield. They'll establish a perimeter. But if his aircraft is already prepped for departure—" "Can they ground it?" Flora said. "Technically, without a federal hold in place. Can they physically prevent it from taking off?" Holt paused. "Yes," he said carefully. "They can do that." "Then do it," she said. "Sort out the authorization after he's on the ground." Holt looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized from years ago. The expression of a man who was being pushed in a direction he knew was right, but was not strictly within protocol. and who was deciding whether the protocol or the right thing mattered more tonight. Tonight, apparently, the right thing won. He raised the phone again. The next 14 minutes were the strangest Flora had experienced in a night full of strangeness. Suspended in the air, Barnes breathing steadily below her, the rotors doing their steady mechanical work above her, while somewhere on the ground, a general officer with $11 million of treason in his history was racing toward an airfield, and a team of soldiers was racing to cut him off. She was not in control of any of it. She had done what she could do, and now the outcome was in the hands of other people, which was, she recognized, genuinely one of the hardest things she had ever been asked to manage. Her hands were in her lap. They were steady. Walter Reed came up in the distance, not visible to her directly, but she felt the aircraft change angle, beginning its descent, and Reyes was running a final vitals check, and Holt was ending his call, and the rotor pitch was shifting. Then his phone rang again. He answered it immediately, listened for 30 seconds, and the expression that moved across his face was not one she could read clearly in the aircraft lighting. He said 3 words, "Confirm that, confirmed," and lowered the phone. "They got him," he said. Flora exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was quiet, controlled, barely perceptible, but it was real. He was on the tarmac, Holt said. Aircraft was prepped. Another 4 minutes and he'd have been airborne. He set the phone down on his knee and looked at her steadily. "It's done." She sat with that for a moment. It's done. 3 years of running, of invisible living, of mapping exits in varying routes and sleeping with one part of her mind always on alert, compressed into 2 words in a phone call in a military helicopter somewhere over the eastern seaboard. "It doesn't feel like anything yet," she said. "It won't for a while," Holt said. "That's normal." "I know it's normal," she said. "I've had operational outcomes before." "This isn't an operational outcome," he said quietly. "This is your life." She looked at him. He was right, and she didn't want to argue with something he was right about. So she said nothing and looked out into the dark air and let the rotors do their work. Walter Reed materialized below them with the organized illumination of a facility that never fully sleeps. A surgical team visible on the landing pad, 2 people with a stretcher, the whole choreography of critical patient reception already in motion before the aircraft touched down. Flora had called ahead through Reyes, specifications transmitted, blood type confirmed, surgical brief prepared. The team on the ground knew what was coming and was ready for it. The skids hit the pad. The next 8 minutes were all motion. Barnes transferred, IV lines maintained, Reyes providing verbal handoff to the receiving trauma surgeon, who was young and sharp-eyed and listened without interrupting, which Flora appreciated. She followed the stretcher to the OR threshold and stopped there. This was someone else's facility, someone else's team. Her part was done. Barnes, being wheeled through the doors, turned his head at the last moment, as if he knew she was there, as if some part of his awareness that should have been fully occupied with staying alive had a small fraction left over to spend on this. He couldn't see her clearly. He was barely conscious, but he raised one hand slightly from the stretcher. She raised hers back. Then the OR doors swung closed between them. She stood at those doors for a moment, her hand still half raised, and then she lowered it and turned and found Holt standing 6 feet behind her, giving her the space she needed, which was, she noted and filed, something he hadn't always been good at. "He's going to be okay," Holt said. "Yes," she said, "he is. The surgical team here is the best in the system. He'll be in recovery by morning." "I know," she said. "I know what this facility can do." A pause. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after sustained, high-intensity movement, when the body hasn't caught up to the fact that it can stop. She was aware of being tired in a way she hadn't been aware of during the night itself, the exhaustion arriving now that it was safe to arrive. "We need to talk," she said. "I know," Holt said. There was a family waiting room down the hall, empty at this hour. Pale walls, chairs the color of old oatmeal, a vending machine humming in the corner. Flora walked into it and sat down, and Holt came in after her and sat across from her. And for a moment they were just two people in a waiting room, which was about as far from the night they just lived through as it was possible to get while still being in the same building. "Tell me the part you left out," she said. He knew what she meant. She watched him know it, watched the small, involuntary tension in his jaw that confirmed she was right, that there was a part left out. "When I found the discrepancy," he said, "the logistics report, that was 14 months ago." He looked at his hands. "I had already suspected Whitmore for 8 months before that, which means for 8 months I had suspicion but no proof, and I made the choice not to act on it." 8 months, she said. "Yes, 8 months of suspicion that a general officer in your command had burned one of your people," she said. 8 months of knowing it might be true and choosing not to move. "Choosing to build a case," he said, "because without proof, going at a general officer is career-ending," she said, "at minimum." He didn't deny it. "Yes, at minimum." "So you protected yourself," she said, "while I was in Oregon learning to be nobody." The words sat in the room. Holt didn't flinch away from them, which she had half expected him to. He sat with them. "Yes," he said, "that's an accurate description of what I did. I built a case, which was the right thing to do for the operation, and I protected my position, which was the wrong thing to do for you. Both of those things are true, and I'm not going to try to separate them." Flora looked at him for a long moment. "I was angry at you for 3 years," she said. "I thought you didn't know. I thought everyone who should have known had failed to notice. And I was wrong. You knew or suspected for 8 of those months. That changes the shape of it." "Yes," he said, "it does." "It makes it worse," she said. "I know," he said. She let out a slow breath. The fluorescent light above them buzzed slightly, the way fluorescent lights always did, the most ordinary sound in the world. Outside somewhere, Barnes was in surgery with the best team in the system. Whitmore was in custody on a tarmac 40 miles northeast, surrounded by soldiers in the beginning of a federal case that would take months to fully materialize, but was, as of tonight, inevitable. The data drive with its $11 million of evidence and its recordings of a general officer committing treason had been received by a Senate oversight contact who was, almost certainly, not sleeping. Everything had moved. Everything had changed. And she was sitting in a waiting room with the man who had let it happen for 8 months too long, trying to figure out what she was going to do with that. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," she said. "I'm not asking you to," he said, "and I'm not going to pretend that the fact that you came tonight, that you came with 8 helicopters and a dying man and told me the truth, I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter, because it does. People do things to fix what they've broken. That counts." She paused. "It doesn't erase what was broken, but it counts." Holt looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, more like the release of something that had been held under pressure for a long time. Not absolution. He wasn't asking for absolution, and she wasn't offering it. But acknowledgement, maybe. The acknowledgement that tonight had been real, that what he had done to correct it had been real, and that real things mattered even when they arrived too late. "What happens to me now?" she said. "Legally, operationally, your record will be restored. Flora Montgomery can be dissolved as an identity or maintained, your choice. Your service record under your real name will be reinstated. The circumstances of your disappearance will be classified, but internally documented accurately." He paused. "There will be hearings. Whitmore's prosecution will require testimony. Some of it will be yours." "I know," she said. "And there's a position," he said, "if you want it. Not field operations, unless you choose that later. A training and oversight role. Combat medical protocol development. Keeping the people who go into the field from dying the way Barnes almost died tonight." She was quiet. You don't have to decide anything now, he said quickly. I know I don't, she said. I'm not deciding now. She looked at the vending machine. She had not eaten since before her shift began, which was, she calculated, 11 hours ago. I'm going to get something from that machine, she said, and then I'm going to sit here until someone tells me Barnes is out of surgery. And then I'm going to sleep. In that order. Everything else after. Holt looked at her, and for a moment the kernel and the operational calculus and the careful management of assets and outcomes was all set aside. And he looked at her the way one person looks at another person who has just survived something very significant and is choosing, with immense practicality, to handle it by getting food from a vending machine. That's a reasonable plan, he said. I'm a reasonable person, she said, and stood up. She got a package of crackers and a bottle of water. The machine's selection was predictably grim, and came back and sat down, and she ate the crackers methodically, and the fluorescent light buzzed, and somewhere down the hall, Barnes was being reconstructed by people who were very good at their jobs. At 04:22, Holt's phone vibrated. He looked at it and said, Barnes is out of surgery. They're calling it successful. He's in recovery. Flora stopped chewing. She swallowed. She set the crackers on the chair beside her. Good, she said. His surgeon says the prior field stabilization was, and I'm quoting here, exceptional under the circumstances. Reyes did well, Flora said. Holt looked at her. You know I'm not talking about Reyes. She didn't answer that. She picked the crackers back up. At 05:15, a nurse came to the waiting room doorway and said that the patient in Recovery Bay 3 had been asking for someone named Montgomery, and was anyone here by that name? Flora stood up. Barnes was awake, barely, the shallow, fragile wakefulness of someone in the first hours post-surgery, tethered to consciousness by effort and nothing else. He looked worse and better simultaneously. Worse because the surgical pallor had replaced the field pallor, and he had the stripped, raw look of someone whose body had just been through enormous violence in the name of healing. And better because his color was coming back in the slow, incremental way of real recovery rather than the artificial maintenance of field management. He looked at her when she came in, and his eyes tracked clearly, which told her the anesthesia was already metabolizing and his cognitive function was intact. How bad, he said. His voice was hoarse from intubation. You'll live, she said. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters tonight, she said. She sat in the chair beside his bed. Splenic laceration. We had to leave a round in place. They'll take it out here when you're stronger. The chest tube did its job. You'll be in this facility for 3 to 4 weeks minimum. Whitmore, he said. In custody, she said, as of about 2 hours ago. His eyes closed briefly, not from exhaustion, from something else, something that looked like the release of a weight he'd been carrying for longer than tonight. The package, he said. Transmitted and received, she said. Your Senate contact has everything. He opened his eyes again and looked at her, really looked at her, the way you look at someone when you're trying to see past the surface into the thing underneath. You stayed, he said. You had a way out. You've always had a way out. You stayed. I already told you not to make it sentimental. I'm not being sentimental, he said. I'm being accurate. He paused, gathering breath, because even a few sentences were costing him. 3 years ago, when everything went wrong, I always thought, if I ever found you, I wanted you to know that I looked. I looked for a long time. Flora sat with that. I know, she said, and it was not until she said it that she realized it was true, that some part of her, underneath the anger and the careful constructed disappearance, had known, had counted on it maybe, had made it one of the reasons, among several, that she had chosen Clover Falls specifically. Close enough to be found by the right people, far enough to be safe from the wrong ones. You could have tried harder, she said, because honesty mattered more to her than comfort. Yes, he said, I could have. No excuses, no negotiation, just acknowledgement, flat and clean. She nodded once. That was enough for tonight. She sat beside him until his eyes closed again, and his breathing settled into the longer, slower rhythm of genuine sleep. Not field-managed unconsciousness, not the shallow rest of someone fighting blood loss, but actual sleep, the kind the body falls into when it finally believes the threat is past. She stayed a few minutes after that, not for any particular reason, just because leaving felt abrupt, and abrupt things bothered her. Then she stood and walked back to the waiting room. Holt was still there. He had not left, which she had not asked of him, but which she found she was grateful for anyway. He's sleeping, she said. Good, Holt said. She sat down and looked at the wall ahead of her. The fluorescent light had stopped buzzing, or she had stopped noticing it, which amounted to the same thing. I'm going to need a few days, she said, before I make any decisions, before I talk to anyone officially, before I give testimony, before any of it. Of course, Holt said, and I'm going to need someone to contact Dr. Alan Marsh at Mercy Ridge Community Hospital in Clover Falls, Oregon, she said. Someone with the appropriate authority to make it clear that what happened tonight at that facility is classified, that his staff acted with extraordinary professionalism under impossible circumstances, and that he personally will face no professional or legal consequences for the decisions he made in that OR tonight. He put his license on the line for Barnes. That deserves acknowledgement. I'll handle it personally, Holt said. And Sandra Kowalski, she said, the nurse, same assurance. Done. She looked at her hands one more time. The steadiness was still there. It had not gone anywhere. It never did. But it felt different now than it had at the beginning of the shift, 11 hours and a lifetime ago. Not heavier, exactly, more inhabited, as if the steadiness had always been the container, and tonight had finally filled it with something worthy of containing. She thought about who she had been at 10:45 p.m. when she walked into Mercy Ridge and signed the log and started her rounds. The quiet, invisible woman with the 2 pins in her hair, the reliable one, the one nobody looked at twice. She thought about what it had cost to build that person and how thoroughly she had built her, and what it meant that she could not go back to her now. She found she was not as sorry about that as she had expected to be. The truth was that Flora Montgomery, the real one, the full one, the woman who could suture a splenic laceration in a community OR and take down an armed intruder in a supply corridor and stand in a parking lot with a sidearm and 8 minutes on the clock and not flinch. That woman had always been here. She had never actually disappeared. She had only been waiting, in the particular patient way of someone who knows their moment will come, for the night when hiding would cost more than being seen. Tonight had been that night, and she had not run. Holt stood up. There's a room here, on the 2nd floor. Medical staff quarters. Nothing luxurious, but a bed and a door that locks. You should sleep. She stood. What happens at 0900? Briefing with the oversight team, he said. You don't have to attend. I'll handle the initial. I'll attend, she said. He looked at her. I'll attend, she said again. Whatever comes next, I'm not doing it from the edges. I spent 3 years on the edges. I'm done with that. Holt held her gaze for a moment, and she saw in his face the things she had been too angry to look for before tonight. Not just the man who had made a wrong choice and taken too long to correct it, but the man who, when the correction became possible, had driven 8 helicopters through the Oregon sky and told her the truth at the first opportunity. Both things were real. She could hold both things. 0900, he said. I'll come find you. She walked out of the waiting room, down the hall, toward the elevator. Behind her, she could hear Holt on the phone again, the machine of accountability grinding into motion. Whitmore's name being processed through systems that would take months to complete their work, but had, as of tonight, been set irrevocably in motion. She pressed the elevator button and waited. She was tired. She was profoundly, bone-deep tired, the way you get after a night that has demanded every version of yourself simultaneously. She was also, beneath the tiredness, something else, something she hadn't felt in 3 years and needed a moment to identify before she trusted it. She was not afraid. She had been afraid, she understood now, every single day in Clover Falls. Not dramatically, not consciously, but in the low, constant way of someone living in a threat posture so familiar they'd stopped recognizing it as fear. The hypervigilance, the exit mapping, the deliberate invisibility, all of it had been fear dressed in the language of preparedness. All of it was done now. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. She did not look back. There were hearings ahead, in testimony, in the long bureaucratic work of undoing what had been done to her life. There were conversations she had not finished with Holt, and with Barnes when he was strong enough, and possibly with herself. The conversation a person has when they have been pretending to be less than they are for a very long time, and finally stop. There were decisions to make about what she would do next, what she would answer to, what name she would carry forward. None of that was tonight. Tonight, Barnes was alive. Whitmore was in custody. The truth was in the hands of people who would use it, and Flora Montgomery, whose hands were steady, who had never run when running would have cost more than staying, who had walked out of a supply corridor and into the worst night of 3 years and refused to disappear, stepped out of the elevator on the second floor and found the room with a locked door. And for the first time in a very long time, she closed her eyes without checking the exits first. She was done hiding, and she was, at last, exactly herself.